Hello friends, and welcome back to another video courtesy of Ireland's second best PlayStation centric YouTuber. The number one, of course, being PSX Gaming Memories, who has in fact been covering weird Japanese PlayStation games long before I have, and also has a much better Irish accent, so, you know, I gotta pay respect to the OGs when I can. Anyway, speaking of weird Japanese PlayStation games, it's time for volume number 12, and I assume you know the drill by now. 3 games selected at random from our Lord and Saviour, Senor Wheel, and 1 final game chosen at random from a selection provided to us by you, the lovely viewer. So sit back, relax, and get ready for another long ass video where I waffle about old video games chosen by the ominous entity known as the Wheel, and you better believe it will provide.
The Wheel will provide.
Kicking things off today, we have Martial Beat 2, one of the many rhythm games that Konami brought to the console during its life cycle, and for my money, this might just be the strangest of them all. Now for those unaware, Konami might just be the most prolific developer in the history of the console. After I started putting together personal lists of games specific developers and publishers brought to the PlayStation, Konami's wasn't just the biggest, but their rhythm game output alone dwarfs the entire catalogs of most other prominent companies. Now in many ways, the 5th generation of consoles was the golden age of rhythm gaming, both in the arcades and on console, and no doubt Konami was leading the way in both markets. Of course, most people will be familiar with the global mega hit that was Dance Dance Revolution, but Konami had rhythm games that not only covered a wide variety of styles, but included a wide variety of control methods and gimmicks too. Drum mania, keyboard mania, guitar freaks, poppin' music, and of course the game that started it all, Beat Mania, a game that features one of my all-time favorite video game controllers. And I guess that's why it came as a surprise to me when today's game, Martial Beat 2, showed up on the wheel, because while I consider myself quite well versed in the catalogue of Konami's rhythm game output of the era, this was actually my first time hearing about the Martial Beat series, and really that is quite the shame, because it's not just a rhythm game, but it's an FMV martial arts fitness rhythm game, and It's kind of incredible. So long story short, in the early 2000s, Konami was kind of big on selling the fitness benefits of their games like Dance Dance Revolution, a good marketing plan to be fair, but maybe one that wasn't quite as upfront as they'd have liked it to be. So they decided to try something new. They basically redesigned a standard DDR cabinet, removed the dance pad, added some motion sensors, and then created a rhythm game where you have to punch and kick in time with the music, or with the high energy martial arts instructor on screen. Think Chop Master Onion's level in Parappa the Rapper, but you're physically doing all the kicking and punching yourself. Now, it's probably pretty easy to imagine how all this works in the arcade, but what about on the PlayStation? Well, Konami thankfully weren't strangers to the owl wacky peripherals, so they launched the game with a set of motion controllers. You attach one to each of your arms and legs, plug the base unit into your controller port, and there you go, you're ready to kick and punch the air in your home. Now, this type of game isn't unusual by any means. We had things like the iToy and Kinect giving us more technologically advanced takes on these ideas, and I suppose Ring Fit is another recent idea that adopted this motion sensor fitness formula. But really, back with Marshall B, it was just as simple as swinging your body in time with the music and instructor on screen, and there you go, everything works great. Now, as much as I'm sure you'd like to see me flail around my home and knock over my furniture, I'm sad to say I don't possess one of these motion sensor peripherals, but worry not. You can in fact play this game using a traditional gamepad. It's a bit awkward and takes some time to get used to, but hey, it does work, so that's how I'll be playing today. And also, this is the first time I've ever decided to do this in the history of the series, but considering how similar both Marshall B and Marshall B2 are, I've actually decided to make this a dual review, covering both games in the series, cause if for example we ended up pulling the first Marshall B, I don't know, 20 volumes later, well, it's basically gonna be the same review again, and since each game is mostly the same bar a new set of songs and some minor changes, well, why not save ourselves the hassle and combine them together. You'll be able to tell which game is on screen by looking at the bottom left here, but honestly most of the time it'll be hard to tell the difference. Anyway, let's talk about the gameplay, and I suppose considering this was not only built upon the Dance Dance framework, but also uses select tracks from the series too, the overall goal here is more or less the same. One of our two instructors will appear on screen at the beginning, both of which being professional fitness instructors, and then you essentially gotta copy what they do on screen in time to the music. Punch with your left or right arm and kick with your left or right leg. Pretty straightforward for the most part. Although unlike most rhythm games which have a sort of beat track for your eyes to follow, this time around you've really gotta just rely on the instructors themselves, although you can see their actions from both the front and back to help avoid any directional confusion. Another way they help you out in game is by shouting instructions to you to give you a heads up of the moves they're about to pull off, but since these are in Japanese, they probably won't be too much use to you until you have memorized the tracks themselves. And this is honestly what I felt I needed to do in this game, actually memorize the routines in front of me, because while there is definitely rhythm and flow to the whole thing, it can change up quite quickly and dramatically, and unless you're prepared for what's gonna happen, you can easily mess up a nice combo string. Now thankfully, since we are using PS1 era DDR tracks, the average length of a song is about 90 seconds to 120 seconds in length, so memorizing them isn't too much of a hassle, and there is also a handy practice mode, so you can finesse your skills on a particular track as much as you like. Now of course, all this is well and good if you're using the sensors, but what about if you're just using a controller? Well, thankfully it's quite simple really. You've got two face buttons for each punch and two face buttons for each kick. Press these buttons in time with your instructor's actions and, well, there you go, a nice basic rhythm game for all. Although, frustratingly, the button combinations change depending on whether you're playing Marshall Beat 1 or 2. For example, in 2, which was the title I first played, the buttons match up with the standard Tekken-style fighting layout, square and triangle for punches and X and circle for kicks. Not only that, the practice mode in 2 does handily give you an on-screen overlay, which makes things even easier to learn for a beginner. In Marshall Beat 1, however, this has been swapped, with square and triangle being used for kicks and X and circle now for punches, and since there's no way to change this in game, not to mention no overlay in practice mode either, if you swap from one game to the other using a controller at least, you're gonna have a hard time adapting your brain to the change, let me tell you. As for the actual differences between the two versions beyond simple button changes, well, for the most part the gameplay experience looks and feels the same. Both games have roughly 12 different music tracks within them, each of which are about as good as the other. We'll take a look at these momentarily. Don't you worry. Each game also has the usual array of fitness diaries, arcade modes, and training modes to keep you busy, although Martial Beat 2, which launched a few months after the first game, no doubt has the wider range of content, as the game not only came on 2 discs, but features punch-specific modes, a 2-player versus mode, and some other cool extras to boot. Plus, that overlay for the practice mode really is quite helpful, so if you had to pick one, Martial Beat 2 is the one to get, just for the quality of life improvements alone. But clearly, no matter which version of the game you decide to try, the major selling point is the incredible mixture of FMV and rhythm gameplay. Some of this stuff is so incredibly funny. It's over the top, cheesy goodness from Japan at its very best. Not to mention the visuals and aesthetics of the game are also oftentimes really cool as well. Like, this looks infinitely cooler than anything the Just Dance series has been able to muster up, you know? It's prime Y2K aesthetic and jankiness all rolled up into one hilarious high energy rhythm game, and even though it might not make for the best pure rhythm game experience, it is certainly one of the most memorable I've ever experienced. Not to mention, the game is full of Konami's awesome rhythm game UI style that was featured heavily throughout this period. It's always been one of my favorites, and I think it often gets overlooked nowadays, but honestly, I could sit on some of these menus for days just vibing along. The whole thing is so cool. Anyway, visuals and aesthetic aside, we all know rhythm games are nothing without their soundtracks, and good news, both of these games are full of bangers, although, as expected, many of these are licensed tracks, so showing them off will cost me that sweet €5 ad revenue I would have made from this thing, but you know what, I'd say it's worth the €5 to show it to you, so sit back and enjoy some highlights from the Martial Beat 1 and 2 soundtrack. Oh god. I love video games. Anyway, that was Martial Beat 1 and 2, easily some of the most bizarre rhythm games I've ever come across, but honestly this is exactly what I'm looking for in these videos. Strange and interesting games that break the mold. Sure, they may not be the best or even the most playable games in the genre, but you know, I feel like my life has been enriched a little by simply knowing things like this exist. And hey, maybe yours will too, but if not, well, this guy's gonna show up to your house and beat you up, so, you know. Watch out. Now clearly, if you want to have the best possible time at this thing, like any rhythm game really, it's in your favor to seek out the controllers purposely made for this thing. But if you really wanted to play this thing with just a controller, it's certainly not the worst thing in the world. It's far from the best, but it is certainly not the worst, and considering we've got tracks from 2 Unlimited, Jerry Halliwell and MC Hammer all performed by a dude firing lasers out of his hand, while I think it's worth putting up with a little bit of jank to experience such greatness, I think you'll agree.
The wheel will provide.
Next up, we have Rock and Riders, a weird extreme sports music hybrid that made its way to the PlayStation in April of the year 99. This game was the product of a developer called Pixie Corporation, who previously created other music-focused PS1 games such as 96's Tomomo Sonoda's Come and Kiss Me, a game that lets you do things like view photos and edit music videos, not too unlike those old Make My Video games over on the Sega CD. You know, the ones with the weird kids fawning over Marky Mark songs. Rock and Riders, on the other hand, is a very different type of game from their previous efforts. While yes, this is primarily made to tie in with a popular Japanese music act, which in this case is a rock band simply called, or a name that makes them incredibly difficult to research on the internet these days, this title also features what you would consider an actual video game, a snowboarding game to be exact. Now this might seem a little bit odd, but the music video at the beginning does feature clips of snowboarding, so I don't know, that's good enough for me. So before we get into the gameplay itself, let's briefly talk about the band. Now first off, I'm going to use this moment to highlight the way some Irish people say the letter or R, as most of the English-speaking world says it. I've received comments in the past that range from mild amusement to legitimate blinding rage from the way I say my R's, and look, as with everything I say, a little bit weird, you know, all the tree variants.
I know that you're only 33 years old. That's 33 in Irish.
I promise you, I'm not doing this to upset you, I'm just Irish. It's how I spoke my whole life, and you can rest assured I don't plan on changing that anytime soon, just so people on the internet will stop sending me weird comments. Yous will send them to me regardless, so at the very least I might as well avoid upsetting the Irish people that watch my channel by changing how I speak to cater to others, and trust me, the last people on earth you want to upset is the Irish. We're not only very, very petty, but we also never, ever forget. Anyway, the stars of today's game is a band called Or, a 6-piece rock band that was part of the Visual Kei movement. What is Visual Kei, you ask? Well, I guess a simple way to describe it would be kind of like Japan's version of the American glam rock aesthetic. Wild hairstyles, bright colourful outfits, and a pretty healthy dose of the old androgyny. Visual Kei was really more of a way of expressing yourself through style and fashion than simply just being a genre of music, as Visual Kei bands could be anything from punk to metal, pop to dance, and, well, pretty much everything in between. Probably the most notable Visual Kei band is the legendary X Japan, as the term Visual Kei itself was originally derived from one of the band's slogans, psychedelic violence crime of visual shock, although my personal introduction to the movement was through the band Dir En Grey, whom I discovered in the early 2000s after a late night internet music dive. Dir En Grey are a pretty funny example of a Visual Kei band because their earlier work looks and sounds like this. While their later work, let's just say, veered pretty far away from this style. Now, as for the band Or, like I said, not the easiest band to find information on, and a big reason why we don't often see music acts named after a single letter. Now, from what I can gather, Or seems to be a group made up of members of other prominent Visual Kei acts, including Penicillin, Bow Wow, Media Youth, and their vocalist who is an idol named Elmo. Did they just gather together for this game? Maybe, but they did manage to release one album, a snowboarding game, and also a special edition of this snowboarding game that comes with a whole extra disc full of pictures of the band, so yeah, good for them. And the game also of course features a bunch of music from the band, as well as tracks from other bands that the members are a part of, and yeah, I gotta say, it's pretty good. Now this is once again licensed music, so quite luckily, since we've already sacrificed the ad revenue for Marshall B, we might as well go all in and make the most of it here too, so don't worry, we will be highlighting some of the game's lovely music later. Honestly, if I was to pay to legally feature these tracks in the video, it would probably cost me thousands at this rate, so if anything, sacrificing the ad revenue is actually turning out to be a pretty good deal when you think about it. Now, if you're wondering why we spend so much time going through all of that instead of, I don't know, talking about the game, well, you'll see why in a moment. So the plot in Rock 'n' Riders centers around our heroes, the 6 members of the band who are on a snowboarding journey through the United States of America. Well, I say snowboarding, you'll be often riding on not snow, but you are using a snowboard, so, that's the main thing. Anyway, in this version of America, music is outlawed and strictly forbidden, which means if we want to reach our destination of San Francisco to play a big old concert, we're gonna have to snowboard our way past our oppressors in the name of our one true savior, rock and roll. It's basically the plot to that Aerosmith game if it was combined with the beginning of Sonic Adventure 2. Now, unfortunately, as exciting as that sounds, the game itself, not so much. So when you kick things off, you have the choice of picking any of the 6 members of the band. Well, 4 of the 6 actually, because as we all know, bassists and drummers are subhuman scum, and as such, not selectable in-game. So you get to pick from one of the 3 guitarists, or LMO our vocalist, and play through 4 levels of extreme sports action. These 4 levels are essentially downhill snowboarding challenges where you race from the top of the level to the bottom of the level, dodging obstacles, pulling off tricks, and avoiding cops, I think. Now, when I first started the game, I was a little bit confused about what the objective was. Do I need to beat this time limit in the top left? Do I need to reach a certain point quota by pulling off tricks? Do I need to pick up this guitar by smashing into the green guy whenever he appears? Well, after multiple failures, I found out the answer is in fact all 3. Beat the time, get enough points, and also make sure you have your instrument, which you get by booping into the green guy, which also happens to get you a bunch of points. Oh, and you've also got to avoid the red guys, which take away your instrument and make you lose a whole bunch of points. So remember, green guy good, red guy bad. This is very important. Now the game itself begins with you picking any of the 4 playable characters who, from what I can tell, all play exactly the same. Same tricks, same movement, maybe there is something different between them, but personally I couldn't tell. And once you pick your character, from there you gotta play through the same 4 levels in a row, those levels being this sandy downhill track, this futuristic downhill track, the only snow track in the game with this lovely little cityscape in the background, and finally San Francisco, which I guess is just the place to be if you want to do some downhill boarding on concrete, which you can also slip on if you happen to turn too quickly, although it does look pretty funny, I'm not gonna lie. For the most part, each of these levels play relatively the same outside of the visual and audible differences, and the whole falling down thing in the final level, of course. The bump in difficulty pretty much just comes down to how many points you need to obtain per level, and outside of bumping into the green guys, the best way to do that is by pulling off tricks. Now, tricks in this game are pretty easy to do, but will take some time to get used to. You can make your rider jump at any time by pressing the triangle button, but to do a trick, you gotta press triangle and one of the trick buttons simultaneously, those being any of the D-pad inputs, L1 and R1 for rotations, and circle if you want to pull off a backflip. Frankly, the easiest way to get big points is to just press a bunch of these buttons together, and you'll end up pulling off some fancy ass tricks, which thankfully are also quite easy to land. Once you begin to earn enough points, these sound levels start appearing in the bottom left, and once you've got 5 of them, well then you know you've got enough points to beat the level. Crashing into obstacles, falling and hitting the red guys reduces these of course, but once you get used to the controls and know what you're doing, the game itself is honestly very easy, and really that's kind of my main gripe with the game. It's a bit too easy and also very repetitive, and if I'm being honest, just kind of boring to play. Once I had beaten the 4 levels with a single character, I had kind of already had my fill, I guess, but of course, I wanted to see if things changed much with the other characters, and after beating the game a second time, and then a third time, and finally a 4th time, well, the law of diminishing returns began to set in. But at the very least, now that we've beaten the game with all 4 characters, watched the ending music video cutscene 4 times over, which is kind of just an extended version of the opening cutscene by the way, I was excited to see if we unlocked anything extra, maybe an additional course, maybe even the ability to play as the bassist or drummer, and I was delighted to find out we did in fact get access to a whole new extra game mode where the game changes into a race against the shadowy goons on a snowy reskin of the first stage, and it also now features combat as well, and let me tell you, this mode is so very bad. The AI in this mode mobs you constantly, and the combat hit detection is terrible. It is one of the least fun things I think I've ever experienced in a game, and rarely would I just outright quit playing something, but this was actually draining a little bit of my soul each time I attempted it, so yeah, I think I'm okay not seeing this part through. So really the game itself, just very mediocre overall. Outside of the awful extra mode, the main content is aggressively average. It plays fine and is competently made to an extent, it's just, I don't know, not very exciting or engaging, which for an extreme sports game about a rock band, isn't really what you want. Oh yeah, I should probably also mention the little extra feature that lets you play a bit of music with each of the band members. It's amusing for about 10 seconds and then you will never turn it on again, but yeah, it is here alright. Now I suppose if there is a highlight to be found in this game, it's the presentation and sound, but even then that's a little bit hit and miss. Graphically, it is far from the most impressive game you'll see, especially by 99 standards, but I do enjoy the character design, some of the UI elements are cool, and some of the levels do look quite nice as well, especially the Snow City level. It's got a real nice vibe going on. As for the music, well, any of the actual music tracks that play during the levels themselves are all really quite good, and a nice little feature is that the track itself builds upon as you increase your points, which I think makes for a nice reward for performing well throughout the levels.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Although for whatever reason, the rest of the music in-game, across the menus and title screen for example, is all super low quality and stuck in mono. It's not something I'd normally pick up on or highlight, but when it's the first thing you're presented with when you boot up the game, it really doesn't get your hopes up for what's to come.
Music.
So when it comes to Rockin' Riders, if we're comparing it to other band tie-in games on the console, like, I don't know, Spice World for example, yeah, it's not that bad really. But if we're gonna compare it to other extreme sports games, then yeah, it's not great really. I think as a fun little curio for fans of the group, it serves its purpose well, but as a game you'd pick up and play today for its gameplay, it's below average at best, and in my opinion, a completely missable experience. It's a shame really, because the idea of a rock band snowboarding against the man is never not going to be a fun idea on paper. But still, at the end of the day, the opening level of Sonic Adventure 2 still manages to pull off this whole thing better than anything present in this game, so yeah, just stick with that I guess.
The wheel will provide.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the red corner, from France, Spike Raffaello. In the blue corner, from the USA, Alex Luster. Round one. Fight!
Alright, this is Funky Boxers, and I kinda messed up with this pick. Funky Boxers is a 2002 release courtesy of developer Pegasus Japan and Victor Entertainment, who are more commonly known as JVC over in the West, and yeah, this game is not a Japan-only exclusive. Now you may wonder how it ended up in this video, considering you can pick up and play this game in pretty much any region, and well, I'll explain that all to you shortly. But for now, let's briefly talk about the game, because I ended up playing through most of it before realizing it didn't belong here, and Lord knows I'm not going to spend a few hours playing a game without shoehorning it into a video somehow. Now, originally when Funky Boxers appeared in the wheel, I got excited for a brief moment because I had vague memories of a Saturn title called Funky Head Boxers and thought it was a PS1 port of that game, and tragically that is not the case, because I mean, look at this thing. No, Funky Boxers is in fact its own thing and is for the most part a fine little arcade style boxing title. I guess a simple way to describe it is that it's essentially a lower budget Ready to Rumble boxing, and really any boxing game is considered lower budget next to Ready to Rumble, seeing as they had to both pay Michael Buffer to use his catchphrase, and there's also however much it costs to license Michael Jackson in the game, so yeah, no wonder Midway would go out of business a few years later. Anyway, since this game isn't a Japan only exclusive, I'm not going to spend a lot of time detailing the whole thing, but in my opinion it's a nice solid 5 or 6 out of 10 arcade boxing title. The combat is fun, if a little loosey-goosey. You've got a whole host of special moves, the cast of characters is pretty wacky, especially this guy who is apparently from Sweden in spite of his sexy USA inspired getup, and the graphics and performance are quite nice. We've got detailed models, and it even runs at 60 frames per second. Although it does come at a cost, as the environment and ring variety is pretty pretty low, and it does kind of run the risk of getting repetitive very quickly. A fun little game for boxing fans, but for the most part, entirely skippable. Anyway, how did Funky Boxers end up here? Well, as you may recall, I built my list of Japanese exclusives based off the video game library's list of every PlayStation game, and if we look here, Funky Boxers apparently only released in Japan. Now, to be on the safe side, I normally double check this information with two of my favorite websites, the PSX Data Center, which also lists Funky Boxers as a Japanese exclusive, and Moby Games, which doesn't even have a listing for Funky Boxers. Not all that uncommon, but hey, as far as I was concerned, this was enough info to convince me that what info I do have is accurate. So we play through the game, make some notes, beat the championship mode, make it to the end credits, and before I begin to capture more footage, I then look into some of the game's history, which leads me to a series called Victory Boxing, a collection of boxing games from Victor Entertainment, which Funky Boxing is supposedly the last entry in. Now, this series has seen multiple entries on the console, many of which came out in the West, and seemingly Funky Boxers here was the only one to end up as a Japanese exclusive. At least that's what I thought until I looked at one of the American entries called Contender 2 and seen screenshots that looked quite a lot like the game I was just playing in Japanese, so I decided to check out Contender 2, and lo and behold, this is Funky Boxers in English. Now, according to the PSX Data Center and Moby Games, Contender 2 released in Japan under the title Victory Boxing, so I decided to boot up the Japanese version of Victory Boxing, and this is a completely different game. Alright, so what about the PAL version of Contender 2, known as Victory Boxing Challenger? This is the same game as the Japanese version, but it's still not Contender 2 or Funky Boxers. Okay, so at this stage I've begun to get very confused, and digging deeper into the series just ended up making me even more confused. Suffice to say, the online information on this series has either been lost in translation or just mixed up along the way, and the unfortunate thing about a series of boxing games that aren't generally considered all that great is that I imagine nobody really cares enough about them to really double check all this stuff. And by all means, this isn't meant to shade towards the video game library, PSX Data Center, or Moby Games, who have all been invaluable resources for my work here on YouTube. It just looks like somebody somewhere got this wrong, and by proxy, everybody has been dealing with inaccurate info ever since. And to be honest, after actually going through the entire Victory Boxing series and noting which game is which, I really can't blame them. This series is a mess. But worry not, folks, because we're going to finally set the record straight once and for all. So please enjoy this brief segment detailing the history of the Victory Boxing series, aka the boxing games nobody cares about. So to kick things off, we have the first entry in the series, which was actually a Saturn exclusive, as well as the only entry to ever appear on the console, and also where some of our issues begin, because while the game did see a release in all major regions, it also got a unique name per region. In Japan, the game was known as King of Boxing, in PAL regions it was known as Victory Boxing, and in North America it was called Center Ring Boxing. So off to an odd start, no doubt, but I will say I love the blocky, low poly models in this iteration, a look that we would only really see in the Saturn entry. Anyway, after this game, we got the next entry in the series, and also the first to appear on the PlayStation. Now, this is more or less an enhanced version of the Saturn original with notably smoother graphics, only this time the game didn't see a North American release. In Japan, it was called Kensei, the King of Boxing, and in PAL regions, it was called Victory Boxing Champion Edition, although confusingly the title screen says Victory Boxing 97. Maybe that was going to be the North American title, but hey, things are only going to get more confusing from here with our next entry. Victory Boxing. Well, that's what it's called in Japan anyway. Yeah, this is the game that we briefly looked at earlier in the video, and is in fact the third entry in the series, this one again never seeing a release in North America. And while it's simply called Victory Boxing in Japan, over in PAL regions it was called Victory Boxing Challenger. Are you keeping track of all this? Okay, good. Because it's time for the fourth entry in this series, which finally sees a return to getting a global release, and Even more names to keep track of. This entry is probably the strangest of the bunch because while the game is fundamentally the same across all regions, the UI and menus vary depending on the region you're playing. In Japan, the game was called Dynamite Boxing and is in fact probably the closest thing we have to what I'd consider a Japanese exclusive, since it has a unique opening cutscene and a completely different style and aesthetic to the Western releases. Well, at least in the menus anyway. As for the Western versions, in North America this game is simply known as Contender and features a much more serious and, in my opinion, boring style in the menus, but the game is the same at least. Although the PAL version, simply titled Victory Boxing 2, is one of the more bizarre games I've ever booted up on the console, cause for whatever reason the game starts off by showing you their PAL exclusive sponsor, Boxing News Magazine, but also an issue of Total PlayStation Magazine that has a Victory Boxing 2 cover. Odd choice immortalizing this in game, but hey, you do you. Also check out the name of one of the characters in this version. Dave the Animal Perry. My god. What a relic of the past.
So we're not seeing Zagreps at all here, Davis, what you're trying to say?
No, we're not. We're seeing somebody just saying he's been set up.
Okay then, and on that bombshell!
Anyway, that leads us to the final entry in the series, which also happened to see a global release, and it's none other than today's pick, Funky Boxers, aka Contender 2 in North America, aka Victory Boxing Contender in PAL regions. A game that is more or less the exact same across each and every region, so yeah, there you go, that's the confusing mess that is the Victory Boxing series. Here it is all laid out in front of you so you folks can take it all in, and feel free to update this on any websites or whatever. Like I said, I don't think people generally care or know much about this series, and it's not terrible by any means. It's just like I said, a little collection of 5 out of 10 boxing games with an incredibly confusing mixture of names for some reason. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this pointless segment about a non-Japanese exclusive PS1 game in a series that's supposed to be about Japanese exclusive PS1 games, and while I'm sure we all learned something new today, I think it's only right that we replace this entry with a proper Japanese exclusive. And since I spent so much time on this Funky Boxers lark and I'm feeling kinda sorry for myself, I'm once again gonna go rogue and make this messy episode that little bit messier by hand-picking a game from today's wheel selection and inserting it as our third game today. Trust me, it's not often I'd want to take the executive decision to override the wheel's powers, but it's okay, the wheel said it was cool and we can't argue with the wheel now, can we? Now, in the interest of fairness, I'll only pick a game that hasn't been suggested as a viewer selection, which means nobody is happy, but I will at least try to pick a fun game, so yeah, let's check that out, why don't we?
Sean will provide.
Would you look at that? It's our next game that totally wasn't sidetracked by weird boxing nonsense. Rally Day Africa is a '98 release on the console coming from a developer by the name of Prism Arts, a rather interesting company, mostly because they started as a business that made computers and diagnostic tools for the auto industry, then pivoted to making video games for a couple of years, and then went back into the auto industry again, which is something they still do to this very day. The years they were active in the video game industry was from around 1996 up until the early 2000s, and considering their history in the auto industry, it probably comes as no surprise that they specialized in racing games. Their first game, another Japan Only PS1 exclusive called Circuit B, is well, it's pretty much the definition of, "Ma'am, can we get Ridge Racer?" No, we already have Ridge Racer at home. Yeah, for whatever reason, they attempted to make a game that was heavily inspired by Ridge Racer on the console that already has Ridge Racer, only it's significantly worse than Ridge Racer. Not exactly a great start for the team at Prism Arts, but their next game would benefit both from more development experience as well as attempting to create a clone of another popular racing game, one that wasn't available on the PlayStation. Say hello to Rally Day Africa, aka Sega Rally, on the PlayStation. Yeah, if Circuit Beat was clearly inspired by Ridge Racer, Rally Day Africa basically burst onto the scene wearing an I Love Sega Rally t-shirt. Now by all means this isn't a bad thing, on the contrary, Sega Rally is an excellent game, easily one of Sega's very best of that era, both in the arcades and at home on the Saturn. The PlayStation, while full of excellent racing games in its own right, many of which are very fun rally titles, didn't really have something comparable to the arcade goodness Sega Rally was offering, and this is where Rally Day Africa comes into play. So can this game come close to or even surpass Sega's offering? Well, let's find out. So I suppose to kick things off, we should talk about the gameplay, and yeah, if you've ever played Sega Rally before, everything should look and feel very familiar to you. Sega Rally is defined by a few different aspects, but at least in the gameplay department, it's the very loose car control that allows you to essentially slip and slide all over the track. It can be a little tricky to master, but once you do, it's incredibly satisfying in motion, and Rally Day Africa here, well, they attempted to emulate that style almost no for no, and I'm delighted to say they did an excellent job on pretty much every front. Seriously, if you play Circuit Beat and Rally Day Africa back to back, it's almost hard to believe these games came from the same developer. The jump in quality and feel is so stark. Slipping and sliding around corners feels great, and there's a notable change in control depending on the type of surface you're racing on, and the dips, jumps and bumps all add their own bit of spice to the game's tracks as well. Speaking of tracks, the game features a grand total of 5, all set across locations on the continent of Africa. We've got tracks taking place in Lake Victoria, Casablanca, Mount Kilimanjaro, and some very tough tracks you'll unlock later into the game, including an awesome race through Dakar and my personal favourite, the ultra hard Congo track, where you can literally drive to your death in hilarious fashion. You'll love to see it. Now, 5 tracks isn't a tremendous amount by any means, and unusually there's no mirror versions available to pad out the length of the game, but for an arcade-style racer from '98, and most notably compared to Sega Rally's total of 3 unique tracks, it more than does the job, and at the very least, there is some nice visual variety across the tracks that are on offer. Although worry not, because let's take a look at the selection of modes and see how they extend the overall game time. Let's start with the main solo content, the Championship mode. This mode sees you tackle the game's tracks across 3 different vehicle classes. K-Class is of course the game's beginner option. It features a selection of smaller, less powerful vehicles and takes place across the game's first 3 tracks. Once you beat that, you then unlock the A-Class, which features more traditional rally cars, many of which are clearly knockoffs of some rally icons. But hey, why not include some knockoff rally cars in your knockoff rally car game, am I right? Not only does the difficulty and speed increase here, but you also unlock the 4th Dakar track as well to close out the series. And once you've beaten that, you can then move on to the S-Class, which you might think contains the fastest cars in the game, and yes, it most certainly does, only they're also now incredibly heavy, which adds a whole new element into the gameplay. And naturally, since the game lets you pick a giant VW bus to race around in, well, needless to say, I'm gonna pick the bus. Now, while these championship races are fun, they're not terribly difficult to beat, and since each race only lasts a single lap in this mode, you can also beat all of them in easily under an hour. So what else is there to keep you busy? Well, other than a fun 2-player split screen mode and this option called Memory Battle, which lets you raise ghost data from a memory card, the only other notable mode is Spot Entry, which lets you pick any of the game's 5 tracks, a car class of your choice, and aim to win a multi-lap race against your opponents. Now, that might not seem very exciting, but if you win a race with any of the cars in this mode, you'll get rewarded with a special tuned-up model of that same car, which features a new paint job and a minor speed buff to boot. And better yet, if you enter into Championship mode again with any of these tuned-up cars, the game basically switches over to hard mode, with the AI increasing in difficulty, not to mention a new secret bonus car being added into the race, which are very, very tough to beat. But if you manage to win the championship, you of course unlock them too. So even though from the outset there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of content, if you want to unlock all the tuned up cars and secret bonus cars, trust me, you're gonna have your work cut out for you. In fact, if I had any real complaint about Rally Day Africa, these tuned up races are super unforgiving, and also, dare I say, a little luck based. Because while driving competently is one thing, the toughest aspect of the game usually comes down to not crashing into your opponents, and while this is nothing new in a racing game, some of the ladder tracks have super narrow segments where it can feel almost impossible not to have at least one crash per race. And in these tougher races, if you make one single mistake, like, I don't know, bumping into the back of an opponent's car, well, you might as well retry and start again. Certainly not a deal breaker by any means, but if you're a completionist who lacks patience, well, good luck with this one, let me tell you. Anyway, now that we've covered all that, let's move on to the presentation of the game, and I suppose we should start with the visuals, which, for my money, are pretty damn good in this title. Cars look nice and detailed, with plenty of visual variety, the tracks look clean and interesting, with lots of little details here and there, not to mention the textures look very nice, with very little warping or tearing, and the performance here is rock solid too, offering a steady 30 frames per second, which I never noticed dipping during gameplay. I also quite like the UI and menus too. It's a much cleaner and modern take on what I think an arcade rally experience could look like. It obviously pulls a lot of influence from Sega Rally in parts, but you know, clearly it's not a game from 1994, let's just put it that way. Although for me, the big highlights of this game come from the audio, and maybe not in the usual places you'd expect. For example, the music in this game is pretty great, although maybe not as great as it could be. A big issue for me with the game's music is that it kind of lacks a fullness to its sound. Like, the compositions are good, but even when turning the BGM all the way up, it still feels a little empty compared to many of the iconic racers out there. Still, that being said, the music does give us this really cool hybrid of a sort of sample-heavy classic Ridge Racer mixed with a bunch of traditional African and tribal elements that makes for a really fun and unique soundtrack when all is said and done.
Engine left! Round, engine left! Engine left! Come, engine right! Engine left! Round, engine left! Come, engine right! Engine out left! Engine out left! Engine out left! Engine right! Come, engine right! Four! Engine left! Engine right! Come, engine out left! Race!
Yeah, pretty great really. Also, special shout out to the little piece that plays whenever you unlock something. Very nice. Also, I noticed one of the tracks seems to sample the same song used in a Hideki Naganuma track from Sonic Rush. Have a listen and see for yourself. So there you go, I guess the Kenyan National Percussion Group made some waves over in Japan, and really who can blame them? This is top notch, no matter where it's sampled. Although setting aside the music, it's the sound effects and, I don't know, arcade silliness of the game that are really some of my favourite things about Rally Day Africa. For one, the cars sound so good during races, the roar of the engines, and in particular the flutter of the exhaust whenever you feather your acceleration around turns. It just sounds so good in this game. Clearly a benefit of having actual auto experts involved in its development. As for the cheesy announcer, well, they really tried to emulate Sega Rally here, down to the in-game navigation, which almost sounds word for word, and most notably, the line whenever you finish a race, which is almost again taken straight from Sega Rally.
Finish!
Finish!
Although this has been ruined for me though, because I once read a comment online stating the announcer sounds like he is saying British instead of Finnish, and since then I've only ever been able to hear British whenever I finish a race. British! Yeah, that's stuck with me now forever, and probably for you guys too. So yeah, that's a look at Rally Day Africa, which for my money is without a doubt the best Sega Rally experience you can get on the PlayStation. Although, is it as good as Sega Rally? It just might be, actually. As somebody who grew up with and has a lot of nostalgia for Sega Rally, I think that game will always be the OG, the arcade rally game that all other arcade rally games aspire to be. Not to mention its sense of style, the music, the announcers, the iconic licensed cars and tracks. Really, as a landmark Sega title and piece of gaming history, it's untouchable to a degree. But if you were to play both of these games back to back with no sense of nostalgia in play, part of me thinks Rally Day Africa actually plays a little bit better. Well, at least if we're talking about home console versions. I think Rally Day Africa is just a bit more beginner friendly in the control aspect, not to mention there's more content here too, so, you know, as a substitute or replacement for Sega Rally on the PlayStation, it's about as good as you could ever hope for it to be, really. And if it had to come out here in the West, you know, other than it really bothering Sega fans, I think this could have gone down as one of the console's very best rally titles. Well, at least in regards to it being an arcade style racer. Don't worry, Colin McRae is still the best traditional experience. I gotta pay respect to the king. Now this game would in fact see a follow-up 2 years later in the form of Rally Day Europe, another Japan only exclusive and the last game Prism Arts would ever develop. It's one of those sequels that manages to be both a significant improvement and also a downgrade in some ways, but since it might show up in the series at a later date, that's all I'll say about it for now. But suffice it to say, if you like arcade rally experiences, driving VW buses off cliffs and Japanese men shouting British at you, Rally Day Africa really is a no-brainer for racing fans on the console.
You will provide.
Well, after much hassle, we finally made it to our viewer pick of this volume, and it's none other than Expert, which made its way to the console in the summer of 1996. This game was chosen for us today by the lovely Sweaty Cowch, and in spite of my concerns about what a sweaty couch might be like, I at least know they can pick a very interesting game to talk about. So, fair play to you. Expert comes from a developer by the name of Nichibutsu, who is also sometimes known as Nihon Busan, a company who were rather prolific during the early years of arcade gaming. Their most popular game is probably the 1980 release Crazy Climbers, which was not only a hit in the arcades, but across most of the early video game consoles too. The game even saw a PS1 remake called Crazy Climber 2000, which unsurprisingly came out in the year 2000 and also features some rather amazing box art. Although beyond their arcade output, a lot of their latter years were actually spent creating mahjong games, in particular strip mahjong games. I mean, if there's a niche in the market that needs filling, I guess somebody's gotta fill it. So between all this arcade goodness and Titty Mahjong, Nichibutsu released probably their most unique game, Expert, and not only is it unlike anything else they've ever put out, it's also a pretty odd genre to appear in a Japan-only video, cause we've got a first-person shooter on our hands. Now, I believe there's a myth that Japan doesn't really like first-person shooters, hence why it's a genre we rarely see from Japanese developers, but for the most part, first-person shooters are quite popular over in the country, and personally, I'm quite excited to see a Japanese dev's take on the genre, even if it is a very early console exclusive take, but hey, you know, beggars can't be choosers. Now, before we dig into the game itself, it's important to highlight the odd history of this game, because in spite of it being a Japan-only exclusive that's relatively obscure to the Western world, this game was actually kind of a big hit in certain places. You see, Expert was commonly sold as a bootleg disc, but under the name Counter-Strike version Expert. In fact, if you look into this game online, way more people seem to know it by this title than simply Expert. Now, as far as I can tell, there are absolutely zero changes to this game in the bootleg version, and it also definitely has nothing to do with Counter-Strike other than some slight similarities, but it's a fun little tidbit of information, all the same. Anyway, here's Expert, an FPS set in modern times that plays in the style of classic shooters such as Wolfenstein 3D, and if you wonder why I highlight Wolf 3D over, say, something like Doom, for example, well, similarly to Wolf 3D, Expert features no verticality. Each of the levels are a flat series of rooms and corridors, and at no point will you ever need to shoot an enemy from above or below, a classic first-person shooter in the truest sense. But in saying that, Expert still manages to bring some unique features to the table that makes it stand out more than some of the more modern examples that you would see on the console. So first things first, the game does feature a plot, and a pretty in-depth and detailed one at that. In a tale as old as time, a big building has been taken over by terrorists. This building not only contains dangerous biolabs and secret information, but also a bunch of innocent hostages too, and as we all know, that's no good. So we take the role of Takuya Kudo, a member of the counter-terrorist team known as Expert, and it's up to us and our team of various other, experts to take back the building floor by floor until we free all the hostages and eventually reach the top. It's kind of got a Die Hard vibe to the whole thing, and I suppose since Nichibutsu also published the weird Japan-only Die Hard game for the PC Engine, it's not hard to imagine that they might have pulled some influence from there. Now, as I said, the plot in this game is surprisingly detailed. You get lengthy cutscenes not just at the beginning of each mission, but also at certain points during missions too, featuring a pretty diverse cast of characters. Honestly, there's so much here that at first I was attempting to keep up with everything using Google Lens, but it was taking so long that I just decided to quit on it pretty early on. So suffice to say, if you can't read Japanese, plot-wise at least, you're gonna miss out on quite a bit here, but even so, it is still kind of easy to pick up on what's going on through various visual cues and the level objectives, so it is still pretty fun even if you don't fully know what's going down. Anyway, once you're into a level, the goal is more or less just to clear the floor of enemies and make it from one elevator to the next, which brings you further up into the building. Although soon into the game, you'll start getting unique objectives per level. One might require you to rescue all the hostages on the floor before you can exit, another might require you to turn back on the power, which leads to a cool night vision segment. So even though the majority of the gameplay is, you know, just shooting goons, the devs still put a whole host of fun counter-terrorism activities in here too to help give the game a bit more flavor and variety. And in spite of the language barrier, it's pretty much always obvious what you need to do during the individual levels, since moving around the map and finding keys always leads you to set objectives, and if you see something weird, well, interact with it and it's usually the key to moving forward. Although that being said, there is one mission that may cause non-Japanese speakers a bit of trouble, and that's the mission where you have to disarm a series of bombs, something I'm notoriously good at doing in video games. You see, in these parts, you gotta cut a series of wires in the correct order, and if you mess up even once, you're of course dead, and dying sends you back to the beginning of the stage. And would you believe it, in this level you've got to disarm 3 whole bombs, which gives you a code to disarm another bomb, which itself is another series of codes, and if you mess that up, it can lead to a mad dash escape in a maze-like level, and yeah, suffice to say I had plenty a death during this level. Of course, if you opt to use Google Lens or save states, which probably would have been the better option, this won't be an issue, but otherwise this was the only instance in the game where a language barrier caused me hassle in progressing further into the game. As for the shooting and controls, well, it's a good old PS1 FPS game. Use your D-pad to move and turn, L2 lets you run, R2 lets you do a quick 90 degrees turn, and of course the all reliable L1 and R1 lets you strafe. It's, you know, what you'd expect, and if you're used to FPS games on the console, you'll feel at home with this game in no time. The shooting, on the other hand, kind of interesting for a PS1 game, because unlike most console shooters, Expert doesn't feature any auto-aim or aim assists, and this is kinda by design. You see, in Expert, enemies go down quick. In most cases, a single bullet is all that's needed to take out a goon, which honestly I kind of appreciate for the realism aspect. Well, unless you're fighting a fat enemy, cause as we all know, the beefier you are, the longer it takes to kill you with a gun. This means Expert places a bigger emphasis on accuracy, which I know kinda sounds weird considering we're playing a shooter on the PS1, but once you're used to it, it actually feels kinda good. Sure, I'll often miss a few shots, but when you manage to line up your shots and take out enemies like, I don't know, some sort of counter-terrorism expert, it's pretty satisfying, I'm not gonna lie. Another cool feature of the game is your roster of weapons, which you actually pick at the start of each level. At the beginning, you have a choice of 2 different loadouts, but as the game progresses, you begin to unlock up to a maximum of 4 per mission, all of which tend to deal with specific enemies better than others. For example, the Uzi and shotgun are great for taking out weaker grunts, and the stun gun, grenade launcher and rocket launcher, all excellent for clearing bigger rooms and tougher enemies, but require a bit more care and precision to use. Personally, I like the Uzi and shotgun the most since most of the enemies can be easily taken out with them, and ammo is also a little bit more plentiful for those weapons, but if you're ever low on ammo, each loadout also comes with grenades, your handy pistol, and a knife, which is kinda bad, but still useful against certain enemies. If you're wondering about ammo for these weapons, well, ammo for each of the weapons is littered around the maps and dropped by enemies too, although when I say each weapon, I mean each weapon, meaning you'll often get ammo for weapons that you don't have equipped, but generally speaking, I never found ammo too much of an issue in this game, even with the need for precision aiming, except for the final level that is, but come on, if there was ever a time for the game to get tough on me, it's the last level, right? Health is also rather plentiful too. Your character can take a few shots before dying, but trust me, if you enter into a situation carelessly, you can die very, very quickly, but as long as you're aware of your surroundings, checking corners, and are quick on the L reflexes, the game gives you more than enough health pickups to make it through each level easily enough. That's until you reach the midpoint of the game though, and the levels start incorporating booby traps, which I gotta say, killed me so many times. Bombs on the wall, not that big an issue, but bombs on the floor, which you can see, but just barely, caught me out so often. And worse yet, certain levels have trapdoors, which, while clearly marked, are instant deaths if you wander over them. So the game really does force you to take your time and be on high alert in the later levels. Speaking of later levels, the game even features a couple of boss fights, which, while nothing special on the gameplay level, I really quite enjoyed for the drama of them all. Each boss has a cool cutscene beforehand with very dramatic music, and the first boss fight is particularly cool because it's a knife-only fight with a time limit that's not only really intense, but the sprite work and attacks on this boss are also really cool. It's a great little highlight of the playthrough in my opinion. The whole game features 9 levels, each of which should take you anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes to get through, making the game a decent sized romp at about 3 hours in total. Sure, a lot of the gameplay is still the classic shooter fare, you know, find keycard, open the door, shoot the bad guy, rinse and repeat, but there's still enough interesting and unique stuff here to make Expert feel like its own thing, and I suppose it's a credit to the level designers that despite the game featuring plenty of rooms and corridors made of mostly identical locations, I rarely ever felt like I was lost during my playthrough, and even the odd time that I was, there's also a handy map to help you out too, so yeah, good work all round. That being said, I suppose we do need to talk about the presentation, which is in many ways the highlight and also the worst part about the game. There's no sugarcoating it. Expert during gameplay is not a very good looking game. Sure, the 2D elements like the weapons and enemy sprites are decent, but the environment's performance and well, all this 3D stuff is some of the worst I've seen in a shooter on the console. I know part of it comes down to the setting itself. I mean, how interesting can you make a 90s office building really? But between the various visual glitches, bland locales, and frankly atrocious draw distance limitations, well, Expert clearly isn't a game for folks that value graphics over gameplay, although I will say a lot of the gameplay and tension would be lessened a bit if the draw distance wasn't like this, but still, it's certainly not ideal. But at the same time, Expert does manage to make up for some of this with great style and atmosphere, which mostly comes down to its cutscenes and music. I know I mentioned I didn't really know what was going on during these things, but there's a lot of cool visuals in them, and dare I say, drama to it all. We also get the odd 3D rendered cutscene from time to time, which are quite charming in that whole they're doing their best sort of way. Also, I gotta highlight the portrait for the player character during gameplay. They're not as animated as, say, Doom Guy for example, but I really love how it changes when your character has new equipment like the night vision goggles or the gas mask. I don't know, I just think it's a really cool design. Also, I appreciate all the enemy sprites wearing gas masks too, a nice little touch. As for the sound, well, the sound effects for the weapons and attacks are good, nothing too fancy really, but my god, the music. If you like cheesy 90s synth, rock music, and dramatic villainous themes, well, this game is packing some serious heat. It certainly won't be for everybody, but I personally loved it, and it was easily one of the highlights of the game for me. Well, that's Expert, and I'm not gonna lie to you, when I first looked at pictures of this game online, I thought Sweaty Cowch ended up picking a joke game for me, one that clearly was gonna be bad, right? And in fact, what we got was a prime example to never judge a book by its cover, or a, in this case, video game by its screenshots. Because while Expert is certainly a rather ugly video game, there is a good game here beneath its exterior. There was never a point during my 3-hour playtime with Expert where I wasn't having a good time, and frankly, I'd go as far as to say that it's kind of a hidden gem really. Sure, it's got issues and it won't be to everybody's taste, but as somebody who enjoys classic shooters and has a particular soft spot for the early console takes of the genre, this is one that I think deserves a wider audience. Well, you know, wider than its odd double life as a Counter-Strike bootleg brought it anyway. So if you're in the mood for a shooter that has some cool ideas, unique gameplay elements, and most importantly of all, some heart and soul, well, maybe give Expert a try. You never know, it may just surprise you too. Well, here we are now, the end of volume number 12. Possibly the messiest of these videos I've ever put out, or maybe even the best, depending on how much you enjoy 10-minute side segments covering obscure boxing games. But hey, there's gotta be at least, I don't know, 5 of you out there who do, and I'm all about making videos for the minority, not the majority, so You know, that's a personal win in my book. We got to check out Konami's premier FMV rhythm games, the one where you run the risk of karate chopping your cat every time you play. A weird snowboarding side project of a short-lived band that itself was a side project of a number of other bands. A side project of a side project, if you will. The PlayStation's #1 Sega Rally impersonator, as long as we're not including their other game, which is also a Sega Rally impersonator, but since that didn't feature in this video, we won't. And finally, a cool first-person shooter from Japan, one that allows you to both fall to your death through a trapdoor and blow yourself up in dramatic fashion. You'll love to see it. So, as always, we need to give each of our games a ranking based on my time with them. Are any of the games must plays, worth trying out if you like the look of them, maybe just kinda meh, complete trash and not worth your time, or maybe even so full of Japanese text that the language barrier was too much for me to enjoy them? Well, Volume 12's entry sees Uroko Riders end up in the meh tier, the Martial Beat games and Expert making their way into Tri tier, and if you can believe it, the game I personally chose, Rally Day Africa, ending up in the must play tier. What are the odds? So look, when it comes to Uroko Riders, truthfully there isn't a whole lot this game does particularly poorly. It controls okay, it looks okay, and the music can be pretty good. But even so, unfortunately the game just isn't really that fun to play. It lacks any real substance, it's very repetitive, the levels don't offer up much gameplay variety outside of the simple visual elements, it can feel noticeably low budget in parts, and all that additional tacked on stuff like the music maker and awful combat racing mode are just outright bad. As far as music tying games go, this is honestly one of the better ones out there on the console, but really that's a very low bar to cross. People looking for a decent snowboard or extreme sports game, I highly recommend you look elsewhere unless you're really in the mood to play one of the Visual K variety, which in fairness there can't be much of, so by all means if that's what you're looking for, hey, you do you. As for the Martial Beat games, well, I'm definitely not gonna say this is the best of Konami's rhythm game output on the console. In fact, from a gameplay perspective, it's probably far from the best, and that's whether you're using motion controls or a regular old PlayStation pad. But let's be fair, I don't think a lot of that matters. If you're playing this game, it's because of how incredibly cheesy and extra the whole thing is. What other rhythm game has a Japanese martial artist fitness instructor dancing to Jerry Halliwell's cover of It's Raining Men while all this crazy stuff is just going on in the background? Come on, that's gotta be worth the price of admission alone. Sure, its fitness focus and visual based inputs won't be to everybody's taste, but it's a game full of personality. It features a ton of peak Konami era style and music, and it's just a bizarre relic of the Y2K era that's often as fun to play as it is to simply just watch, and for that alone, I think it's something worth checking out for fans of the genre. Now when it comes to Expert, as I said before, this is a game that caught me by surprise. Don't let the rough graphics and very classic shooter gameplay fool you. This is a very fun and oftentimes intense little video game. It takes a lot of the classic FPS gameplay we all know and love, adds its own little twist to things like unique mission objectives per level, a bigger emphasis on story and cutscenes, and some outright cool moments, all backed up with a cracking little soundtrack. The fact it's an old school shooter focused on precision aiming while utilizing a PS1 era FPS control scheme is probably enough to turn plenty of people off, but if you're willing to learn its quirks and dare I say, get good, this might actually be one of my favorite exclusive shooters on the console, even in spite of its issues. So yeah, ignore the graphics, get good at strafing, and seriously use some save states on those bombs, and you'll be in for a pretty good time. And finally, we have Rally Day Africa, which, look, as a big racing game fan, especially of arcade racers and arcade rally racers in particular, this is a game I think more PlayStation fans need to know about. Yes, it is unashamedly a clone of a more popular Sega franchise, just like a few of the games we've looked at on this series so far, but similarly to those, it ends up being a damn good one in its own right. One of the reasons I love this console and its library so much is that there is quite literally a game for everybody. Whatever genre, mood, or style you're into, the original PlayStation probably has what you're looking for. And when I was growing up with my PlayStation and went to my friend's house to play Sega Rally on his Saturn, I always thought, damn, I wish the PlayStation had this game, and lo and behold, it kinda does. It also helps that it plays great, has a decent chunk of content, some really fun music, excellent graphics, and of course a healthy dose of arcade cheese. And well, yeah, Rally Day Africa is pretty much a must play for fans of this style of racer. Sure, we could weigh up its merits and compare it to the actual Sega Rally all day long, but personally, I'm just happy I have 2 good 5th gen arcade rally games that I can play when I'm in the mood for something fun, and at the end of the day, that's really all that matters. So now that we're done with that, up first I'd like to give a special shout out to the wheels chosen this episode, the lovely Sweaty Cowch, who, by the way, went to the effort of putting together a cool bootleg version of the Club PlayStation mixes, and they also probably put way more effort into their version than mine, if I'm being honest, so yeah, check that out. And also, as a cool byproduct of this, it has also led to another follow-up to the bootleg series courtesy of Claude Van Foxbat over on Mixcloud, which is also pretty incredible. I'll leave a link to both of these mixes in the video description, but just so people are aware, you all have my blessing to make your own version of the Club PlayStation series if you like. At the end of the day, I'm just happy to see people appreciating and celebrating the excellent music this console has to offer, so by all means, if you're sitting on some deep cuts and bangers, get to work. But if you want to ignore all that music stuff and just add your own pick to the viewer wheel for future episodes, drop your selection in the comments below and I'll get it added for you as soon as possible. And finally, to close things out, I need to give a special shout out to all my lovely supporters over on patreon.com who continue to help make videos like this possible, including fine folks like Alan Caslin, Crimson Cyclist, Dave Nolan, Doma, Fergal O'Hagan, Globe99, Justin Drown, Kyle Winter, Moomatron, Moomin Biscuit, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, Mr. the Joshmon, Richard Kramer, Shadowman13, and Spectre117, who have all subscribed at the Fan++ tier. As always, I'll be back ASAP with some more original PlayStation content, but until then, thank you so much for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you again real soon. See ya!
I get knocked down.